Good evening and welcome to Civiltà Cattolica, to all of you. It's my pleasure and honor to host a celebration of the Centennial of the Walsh School of Foreign Service of Georgetown University here in La Civiltà Cattolica. Thanks to the President of Georgetown, Jack DeGioia, the Dean, Joel Hellman, the members of the School of Foreign Service, the various communities of Georgetown University represented here, and our guests this afternoon. The oldest magazine of the Society of Jesus, founded in 1850, becomes today the place for the celebration of the oldest Catholic and Jesuit university in the United States, located in the nation's capital and open to students of all nations, cultures, and religions. The Society of Jesus has always taught us to have a universal vision and never to consider anything as foreigner. The Walsh School is a school of international relations, and it seems to me that it intends to embody and proclaim this open and universal vision of the world. It is the same look that La Civiltà Cattolica wants to give to its readers, with its contents spread in 5 languages: Italian, English, French, Spanish, and Korean, and written by Jesuits from 5 continents. Since the beginning, the Society of Jesus has embodied a global vision and horizon. From St. Francis Xavier to Pope Francis, the Jesuits have traveled to the ends of the earth, seeking to spread the gospel and to advance intercultural and interreligious dialogue in the service of global humanity. In a continually changing and unpredictable world, the mission of the school is to prepare women and men to be creative leaders with a commitment to service and an understanding of the ethical component of global affairs. The vision of the School of Foreign Service is to contribute to global peace, prosperity, and human well-being by educating future generations of world leaders and expanding the knowledge, understanding, and values that will inform their leadership. With the global order being questioned in so many ways, we need people formed by Christian and Ignatian values for the common good. Nationalism and isolationism are on the rise everywhere, casting doubt on global trade and international institutions. Our mission has never been more important than today. We need an open thought, able to face the challenges and to understand the changing times. Addressing the writers of our magazine on the occasion to mark our 4,000th issue, Pope Francis told us, "The crisis is global." And he added, "Only truly open thought can face the crisis, understand where the world is going, and handle the most complex and urgent crisis." Open thought is a flexible thought. It understands the situations as they are taking place and knows how to evaluate meaning and consequences, even beyond appearances. This is what we also call discernment. For Francis, mercy is not an abstract concept. It is the action of God within the life of this world, in societies, in human groups, in families, and individuals. God not only acts through the lives of individual people, but through the historical processes of peoples and nations, even the most complex and intricate ones. The Church itself is described by Pope Francis as being fully part of our cities, its borders demarcated only by the permeable, flexible, tent-like walls of a field hospital. The church is in the middle of the field, not set aside on a mountain, not retreating like a bright, isolated, distant lighthouse. Francis's understanding is the same of that of St. Ignatius. God acts in the world. In his interview to Civiltà Cattolica, Francis said, God manifests himself in time and is present in the processes of history. This gives priority to actions that generate new dynamics. We need to understand the dynamics that move the world. We will be able to recognize the positive movements present in human history only if we have a spiritual formation to great values, and only if we are aware of the tensions that steer the reality of our world. But we must also have a deep conviction, which is what I wish for the Walsh School of Foreign Service, never to consider anyone or anything as definitively lost in relations between nations, people, and states, because this is the heart of the political understanding of the gospel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Spadaro, and thank you for your wonderful hospitality in enabling us to be here in your home for our conference on Jesuits and global impact. Just a few months ago, we came together right here to launch a new project, a joint project between Georgetown and La Civiltà Cattolica, and that is the China Forum for Civilizational Dialogue, and we're honored to be partnered with you in that dialogue. We're also grateful to you for your leadership in our work together, for your contributions to our global faith community, and as a member of our Georgetown community. So thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. If you caught Father Spadaro's opening words, which you might not have caught, you said good evening to everyone, and that's just a reflection of this is an American style timing. We should be doing this a little later in the afternoon. This didn't fit for anyone. But truly, good afternoon and welcome. It's terrific to have this opportunity to come together for this very special gathering. It's a very special time for Georgetown as we come together to recognize the Centennial of our School of Foreign Service, to recognize our long-standing commitment to global service and the way that this commitment has been shaped by the mission and impact of the Society of Jesus around the world. We have spent some time reflecting on this question of the impact of the Jesuits on their relationship to globalization, how their role has evolved over 5 centuries, and we're grateful to have so many members of our community here today to join in this conversation. There are 2 leaders on our campus who have played a disproportionate role in enabling us to come together today: our Dean of our School of Foreign Service, Dr. Joel Hellman, and our Vice President for Global Engagement, Dr. Tom Banchoff. I could not think of 2 more appropriate individuals to lead us in our gathering today. So Joel and Tom, as we celebrate our centennial and deepen our work around the world, we're so grateful to you both for your contributions and for your efforts to bring together our community for this forum, for this discussion and dialogue today. So thank you. Now, our time together also would not have been possible without the leadership of a few members of our alumni community. In particular, there are 2 individuals I just would like to identify in these opening remarks. First, Sarah Thun Hohenstein and Olga Maria Beck. And Sarah and Olga Maria, we're grateful to you both for all that you've done to ensure that we could come together in this way. We know what it takes to put together an event like this, and without your support, this would not have been possible. So thank you both. You, along with a dedicated group of alumni and friends, many of whom are here today, have made this conference a reality and also have helped shape the framework in which we are going to have 1 year of celebration. we launched this on Saturday, formally. Well, we've had a lot of run-up to Saturday. On Saturday, we had our commencement exercises of the School of Foreign Service. We had as our commencement speaker Madeline Albright, who joined our faculty in 1982. And Madeline was just extraordinary in the joy of her presence and her sharing with our young graduates a very challenging set of demands for new leaders in our world. And it was a great launch, and this is the next step on the journey. And just being a part of this first week of this celebration, I hope I can drag myself across the finish line by the time we get to the end of this year. But we have appointed Centennial Fellows from around the world to engage our community. We've hosted the Lloyd George Centennial Lectures, which have pursued topics including the future of the global economy, national security, globalization. We held the Future of Diplomacy Symposium by our School of Foreign Service in partnership with the Institute of Politics and Public Service at our McCourt School, featuring a keynote by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Our time together today provides us with a unique opportunity to engage the global mission of the Society of Jesus. Since the founding of the Society almost 500 years ago, to the founding of our university in 1789, to the establishment of our School of Foreign Service in 1919, we have been sustained by a tradition committed to global engagement, a tradition committed to pursuing the common good. For us, this took on a new dimension in our School of Foreign Service, conceived in the years following the First World War to develop a new kind of public servant for a nation coming to terms with its new role in our world. At the time of its founding, it anticipated the creation of the Foreign Service of our Department of State 5 years later. Joel's heard me joke that they needed a graduating class to be able to get that department started. But since its founding, the school has always been guided by a spirit of engagement, a tradition of service, reflected in the words of Father Edmund Walsh in his address at the founding of the school. He said, and I quote, "The awakened consciousness of essential human rights and their reciprocal obligations, together with the realization of the very definite lesson that peoples of the world constitute one huge family whose interests are common and whose members are interdependent, has proved to be one of the most valuable byproducts of the world tragedy now happily ended." Close quote. That was in 1919, and the spirit behind those words is as resonant this afternoon as it was 100 years ago. It's as resonant to this moment. It is as resonant to the commitment of the Jesuits 5 centuries ago and to this very moment. And that will be evident as you hear the words that will unfold this afternoon. This year, as we celebrate the centennial of our School of Foreign Service, we celebrate our shared commitment to serving a global community, a community alive and a commitment alive in our tradition, a commitment enlivened by the people, programs, and partnerships that are present today here in this gathering. So we're so honored that all of you could join us this afternoon for this very special event here in Rome. I want to thank you all for being here. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dean Joel Hellman, who will introduce our first panel. Joel?
I think Matt here, Scheherazade. Oh, I'm on the other side?
Yeah,
Okay, sorry.
There we go.
Excuse me. Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. It's absolutely wonderful to be here to celebrate our centennial with you. As Jack just sort of said, we launched the centennial only a few days ago. It starts with the graduation, this current graduation, and ends with the 2020 20 graduations. So it's one full year, a steamroller set of events. But I couldn't be happier that really one of the first efforts to celebrate the Centennial is rooted here, deeply rooted in our values and what it means and what the century has meant in the creation of the School of Foreign Service. So it's a fabulous opportunity to be here to discuss these issues, to discuss our linkage and background to our Jesuit heritage and identity. We have a fabulous panel to do that. I'm going to open up with some remarks about what the Centennial means for us and how we're kind of thinking about the celebration. And then we're going to have a discussion of the Centennial from different perspectives. First, from within the school, we have Father Matt Carnes. Father Matt Carnes is an associate professor in the Department of Government, but he's also the director of our Center for Latin American Studies and has been an important part and fixture of the SFS community. We have Scheherazade Hessemsad de Borsasson, a great alumna of the School of Foreign Service, the managing director of Politico Europe, a board member of the university, and an enormous friend of SFS and the university. And we're extremely pleased to have Father Tom Smolich here, the International Director from the Jesuit Refugee Service, to talk about some of the enduring values and how it links to JRS's mission. So I just want to sort of start by maybe giving you a little bit of background about this extraordinary moment that we have the opportunity to celebrate. It would always be wonderful to celebrate the oldest school of international affairs in the United States. There's an incredible history, incredible legacy of impact and of service. But we come together, as President DeJoy said, in an extraordinary moment in the discussion and engagement of the global order, which gives a resonance and an importance to the celebration of this centennial that we could not have anticipated. This is not just an opportunity to look at a great school and the impact that this great school has had. It is really an opportunity to go back and examine the values that led to the establishment of the school, the enduring importance and critical impact that those values have played in shaping the global order, the challenges to some of those values that we're sort of seeing, some of them that we have to confront and deal with, that these are not just challenges of interlopers, but there are real issues and problems that have been raised over time around the values that were created that led to the challenges that we're seeing today, and thinking about how we envision the next 100 years of SFS so that we are continuing to promote the core values that led to the creation of the school. So I think it is our moment to some extent. It is our moment to help shape the dialogue. It is our moment to help progress the dialogue. It is our moment to understand and rethink the values that led to the creation of the school and their enduring impact in the world. So it couldn't be more exciting to begin this year here, and to think about the importance of this year, because I think we have a mission beyond just the celebratory. We have a mission, I think, with a continued global impact. So I do want to take you back, though, to a little bit of the history and the story of the school, because I think it's such an extraordinary one. It is important to remember, I think, and it really does weigh upon me when I think about the values that led to the creation of the school, that this was a school that was born out of violence and destruction. This was a school that was a direct response to the greatest global conflagration, the greatest number of casualties, both civilian and military, that the world had ever seen in World War I. The founders of the school were reeling from that devastation, and they were committed to thinking about how do we ensure that this destruction doesn't happen again. And that destruction was real to them. Everyone knew someone who was impacted. Everyone faced the impacts of that destruction, and it was a global destruction. What was happening in 1919? In 1919, not only were they trying to think about what would be the basis for peace, but the world was coming together to rethink the very shape of the global order. To go back again to 1919, in January of 1919, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, gets on a steamship and travels to Paris, where he would stay for 6 months, together with leaders from 52 countries around the world. 6 months he stayed in Paris and negotiated 6 to 8 hours a day with the leaders of the world, the various elements of the global order: economic, political, alliances, security, trade, you name it. Now, some people today, I think, would be very happy if some of our presidents went off on boats to foreign lands for a very prolonged period of time. But it was an extraordinary feat of global imagination to have the leaders of the world come together, presidents and prime ministers, and sit down in a sustained way and negotiate the shape of the world order. It was in that flush of excitement that we could organize the world differently. There are different principles upon which the relations across states could be created. There are different values that ought to motivate international affairs beyond standard balance of power that had been essentially dominated European politics for centuries. This was the intellectual ferment. This was the intellectual flush that created the environment in which the need for a school of international affairs, the school dedicated to international affairs, would be created. And I think it's very, very important to realize, because in that ferment, in that excitement, what we saw were new values being created. One, a value and a notion of mutual security, that our security is based on not on a balance of power, but on an ability to create a mutual security framework. A recognition of the importance of an international rule of law, that law could be a way of essentially organizing relationships among states. An importance of trade and economic integration, which would be critical to that discussion. And so many of our early founders actually came from the business world and were thinking about how the school could create a generation of traders who would build the economic integration that was necessary. But most important in that ferment were the values of cultural empathy and how to build cultural empathy that I think builds so strongly on our Jesuit background and our Jesuit identity. Because fundamental to the creation of the school was a notion that in order to build peace, we have to build understanding across cultures, and that understanding comes from an understanding of culture itself from a multifaceted framework. So from the very start, the school said, first and foremost, language is critical. Because if you want to understand the culture, you have to understand its language. You have to see it as it sees itself. You have to speak its language. You have to deal in its language. You have to understand history, politics, economics, and the interrelationships across them. And you have to build this in a multidisciplinary core curriculum that is designed to try to build empathy for the way others see the world. I think that is perhaps the most fundamental aspect of the creation of the School of Foreign Service. It is something that Father Walsh, and we're going to hear more about Father Walsh today, Father Walsh was deeply committed to as the first regent of the school. In fact, and I've told this to many people, many of the founders of the school, as I said earlier, came from the business side of integration. In fact, the first benefactor of the school was the head of U.S. Steel. He indeed wrote the first proposal for the creation of the school, because he thought after U.S. Steel was producing for the war effort, he wanted to make sure that we can continue to export, that economic integration would become the glue that binds us all together. So he had the idea, among a number of businessmen, of creating a School of Foreign Trade. And indeed, the first piece of paper that ever created the School of Foreign Service had on the top the School of Foreign Trade. But in that first piece of paper, which I want to put as the cover of perhaps one of our centennial celebrations, You see the word trade crossed out, and someone writes on top of it, service. As President DeJoy said, not because of the U.S. Foreign Service, but because of the notion that if we are going to create a school dedicated to understanding it, if we're going to create a school that is going to build peace, it has to be based on a principle of service. And service became a core component of the value of the school. So this ferment, I think, shapes who we are. It shapes the curriculum that we created in 1919 that has, to some extent, variations of which still remain at the core of what we do at SFS. Now, we know that they were not successful in that first flush of 1919, that their efforts to build peace were not successful in the sense that there was still a tendency towards isolation, a tendency towards disaggregation. The desire to build a true multilateral framework and mutual security framework failed, again with devastating consequences. But in my view, the core principles, the core ideas, and the core values were built in 1919, and I think shaped and structured the school and the many generations that were trained in the school. So fast forward to 100 years later, where those values have shaped generations of our students, but those values which have in fact produced tremendous progress on just about any indicator that we can look at, on human security, on human development. The share of poor that has been reduced on global human poverty index has never been greater. The share of poor has never reduced in such a strong way as it has been over the last 25 years. The level of security and the reduction of conflict, the degree of development and economic integration. Although these things have been wonderful manifestations of the core values of the school, it is remarkable that so many of those core values are now being deeply questioned. And as we approach the Centennial celebration, as we approach this year, we are shaping this year to do two things. One, to recognize those values upon which we were created, but two, to ask, why have those values been challenged? What is at the root of those challenges? And to what extent do we need to understand and rethink some of the core aspects of what we have been engaging on over the last decades to understand where those challenges come from? Where is the tendency towards isolationism? Where is the tendency towards nationalism? Where is the tendency towards populism? Why have these erupted again with such force despite the progress we've seen? And how do we try to sort of shape our curriculum to understand that? So as we think about our centennial and think about our centennial celebrations, the lectures that President DeJoy mentioned, the Lloyd George Centennial Lectures, the seminars that we're bringing together, the event in Washington that we're planning in November 15th, 16th, 17th, which I hope all of you will mark on your calendars, they are all designed to ask the question of what the next 100 years needs to look like in order to be true to the values that we were created for. And I think we're going to try to shape the dialogue around that. So I wanted to use that as a background just to kind of give you a sense of how we're thinking about the Centennial celebration. And then we can go deeper into the discussion and into questions about some aspects of that Centennial celebration, how we're going to do that, how we're going to ask those challenging questions, and what those mean for the future of the curriculum and the future of the kind of training and generation that we're going to give for new generations of students. But let me stop there and now turn over to Father Carnes to talk a little bit more about those values and the relationship that has to our Jesuit background.
Thank you very much, Joel, and thank you for that, I think, marvelous overview of the founding of the school. You used three words that I want to use to organize my thoughts today. Values, challenges, and I might actually say challenges / ferment, and imagination. It strikes me that those go to the heart of the Jesuit understanding of the world and the ways those get played out at a place like SFS, at a place like Georgetown, and in particular ways inside my own classroom at the SFS and at Georgetown. First of all, values. Father Spadaro spoke so wonderfully to that key Jesuit value of knowing that God is active in the world. God is active in cultures, in societies. It was one of the things that Father Walsh most understood as he and the others thought about what values do we want to commit ourselves to. This idea that God is active in every different part of the world, and that we are most activated and discover God active in places often very different from our own. The other key Ignatian insight, really about God's activity, and key Ignatian value, is that God is active in individuals. Ignatius used to say Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, that God treats with individuals. God is, in a sense, working with each individual. And what this means is every single human being is sacred. Every single human being is on a sacred journey in their cultures, embedded in their societies. And part of the joy of living this life is discovering where God is active in every place and helping offer the opportunities for that to fully flourish. In some ways, those are the same values that Edmund Walsh had when he started the school. This idea that after this terrible conflagration, we need to rediscover where is God active in societies. We need to rediscover where is God active in each human person. And if you think about the development of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, so much flows out of that same sense of God being active in every single individual. And that's something that's motivated the Society of Jesus since its founding. It shaped its decisions about founding places like Georgetown, the School of Foreign Service. But then in a particular way, it has influenced the way the Society of Jesus responds to each moment. 1919, the moments you described. I want to talk about the way the Society of Jesus is thinking about its global engagement today. Just in the last couple of months, the Society of Jesus released what's called its Universal Apostolic Preferences. These are, in a sense, saying, let's take those values and let's respond in a preferential way, not a priority way, not a way of saying this is absolutely first, second, third, but ways that should be key orientations for us as we lean into this present moment. And they're built around challenges the Universal Society of Jesus has seen today. So first challenge, first maybe point of ferment, I would say. The first one is what our previous Superior General of the Society of Jesus called a globalization of superficiality, a disenchantment of the world, a fascination with the expedient and the moment and the shiny and the flashy, and a lack of a sense of the sacred, of the truly valuable, of the truly meaningful. And out of that present moment, which often gets characterized as secularism in some ways too, the Society of Jesus says our first apostolic preference actually is rediscovering and communicating in new ways the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, which are a way to discover what is most sacred, a way to discover God active in the world, a way for each individual in their own unique personality to come to know God who treats with them. And if we do that well, as a Society of Jesus, we will help people discern vocations in their own lives, what's meaningful to them, what matters to them. And let me tell you, in my own classroom and my own treatment with students, this is something that fascinates them because they often find themselves somewhat adrift in a world where there seem to be so many things in question. To find a true orientation for themselves, to not be caught in that constant cycle that now actually has an acronym created by a Georgetown grad, FOMO, fear of missing out. Fear of missing out often dominates their lives. There's always one more flashy thing, one more thing. And they so long to really be able to become centered and discover what's their truest vocation. How am I called to respond to this world? What can I do that will be best, the magis in my life? So the Society of Jesus, our first apostolic preference, focus in on those spiritual exercises and on the tools of discernment so people can discover what's sacred, what really, really matters. Second challenge of this moment, second moment of ferment, is the ways that we still see, in spite of the incredible economic growth we've seen, incredible escape from poverty around the globe, still too many people are left behind. Still too many people are left on the margins. And so the Society of Jesus says the way we respond to this present moment is by walking with those who are on the margins, walking with those who are excluded. In a particular way, refugees, we've never seen such a massive flow of migrants around the globe. Refugees driven from their homes, both internally displaced and then in foreign countries as well. And the Society of Jesus is saying that's where we will discover God active in particular ways. That's where we need to be present to walk with. And this is actually a bit of new imagination that you can see the Society bringing. I like to think, you mentioned, at the moment of 1919, new economic activity, Trade was really crucial. Service then became the word to describe how we wanted to think about trade. I think now the word would probably be used would be solidarity, walking with. It's not so much coming and saying, I will do for, and I'm sure Tom will talk about this more, for those who are on the margins. It's actually saying, I will share in the life of those who are on the margins. I will walk alongside them as they go through this moment of suffering and often a moment of transformation, and maybe the opening up of new opportunities as well. So the second priority for the society is precisely that, walking with the poor and those who are on the margins in so many different ways in our church and in our world. The third priority is one that comes from the challenge that Pope Francis has highlighted so many, many times, our current environmental, potentially catastrophe, the ecological change that is happening on our planet at an unprecedented pace. And Pope Francis has challenged us to imagine this in a new way by saying we need to care for our common home. We need to imagine, if before it was imagining that we could understand cultures across lines, now it's saying that actually we share a single common planet, a common home, to which we are all heirs, all have responsibilities, and all need to tend to it in a particular way. And so the Society of Jesus has elevated this to be one of its highest preferences, to say we need to be co-gardeners, if you will, of the planet. We need to nourish it. We need to make sure that we sustain it for future generations. And then finally, the fourth priority for the Society of Jesus, or preference, I should say, for the Society of Jesus, is this idea of walking with the youth who will form the next generation. And the Society identifies in this moment of ferment, in this moment of challenge, a disenchantment of the world, almost going back to my first point, a certain loss of hope among youth. And it says the most important thing we can do through our educational institutions, through our work with refugees, those children on the margins, the most important thing we can do is nourish in them a sense of hope, a sense that the future can be better than what they're seeing. At a moment when, and it's so striking in my classroom these days, so many things that seemed like solid foundations are now much more tenuous. Democracy and the quality of democracy, which seemed like it was sort of naturally going to keep flowing and growing, actually has really started to retreat in really scary ways. And this leaves students wondering, how do I fit into this? What sort of structures, what sort of institutions will work? Economic growth, which has delivered so much prosperity, but still leaves so many behind, has left them questioning, how do I fit into this? What sort of new opportunities could there be for new models of economic inclusion? How can we make that happen? They want to discover these new things. So the Society of Jesus says, in this moment of ferment, when institutions and values seem to be questioned, we need to walk with youth so that they can discover hope in this world, hope that they can commit to, hope that will ultimately redound back to that first point about their own personal vocation, but it's about a vocation that then is in common with so many other people. So I like to think, as we start celebrating our centennial year, we're very fortunate to have the Society of Jesus handing us these particular preferences because they speak to our moment and they actually enrich our discussions that we're having on campus. The future of diplomacy, the future of global business, the future of entrepreneurship. All of these questions are in such wonderful play, and the Society of Jesus helps contribute to that, doing it from our values and allowing us to maybe imagine in new ways. So it's going to be an exciting year, I think. I really look forward to it. And I also look forward to hearing the reflections of my colleagues here on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Sherry's
So
on.
maybe more having gone through the School of Foreign Service in the past century, so that makes me old. I want to, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the panel for a lot of reasons, but one reason is I went back to read, actually, Father Walsh's aims for the School of Foreign Service, 25th of November, 1919. It's available on the website of the School. I really engage everyone to read it. It could have been written today. There's so many sentences, probably just one. You'll see the relevance. World commerce properly conducted safeguards world peace and promotes the common weal. That could be probably a good advice given the past 72 hours or a couple of weeks. I think what hit me the most is probably something reading this text was how the obligations of the United States entering the stage of world politics and world commerce was not about self-importance. It wasn't about national vanity, Father Walsh talks about the obligations and the duties that go with that. I think that has been maybe through my experience at Georgetown. When I arrived at Georgetown, I was actually still a political refugee from Iran to France. It took me hours to get my visa. I was always the last one waiting for my US visa. I came to Georgetown. I didn't even know it was a Jesuit school because at the time we did not have all these websites. I just wanted to go to what I thought was the best international school for foreign affairs. And I got there, and what is very different at Georgetown, after taking classes with Father Shaw, may he rest in peace, one of my most amazing professors, Father Winters, I discovered that the ethics, the overarching mission of the Jesuits was very present in a subtle way, but that made the whole difference. It wasn't the excellence just of the curriculum. It was just not an amazing location of being in Washington, but it was also about everything had a purpose. International affairs wasn't just about power and influence. I discovered also probably the devotion, the spirituality, and also the salvation. And having these courses with Madeline, who used to be my professor for a couple of years, but at the same time having courses with Father Shaw on ethics and international relations. Making sure we're having great courses from professors from IMF, but along with these greater questions. And that was probably for me the most amazing experience. Was I left Georgetown, not just thinking about what I can do next or what about me and the self-importance and but really what as a leader, as a citizen, as a mother, what's the duty, the role and obligations, and how can we contribute to the bigger and common good, may it be from your very close, from your family all the way to your company, to your employees, and to other stakeholders. And I do believe that comes from our Jesuit tradition, very firmly. And the interreligious, which for me, having ran away from a theocracy, believe me, when you run away from a theocracy, arriving on campus and seeing priests can be scary. You're like, oh my God, I ran away from Iran, what am I doing here? And the interreligious courses were also the mandatory, some of these theology courses we have, which today religion is such a big, obviously, topic also in the tension in international affairs. The interreligious courses we're offering, the campus, how international it is, but also the way, I think with our missionary, we've built out the different peaceful discussions was for me very enlightening. So it's a whole journey. It's more than just a school of foreign service. It's just more than a school of international affairs. It was an experience of learning more than just about international affairs. So, and I think that is definitely because of the overarching Jesuit tradition of the languages, of the global understanding, and maybe what the true globalization is. I had a student the other day who was applying to several schools, and I said, if you want to go and learn about objective globalization, how things interlink and how people move around and what are the goods and how capital markets, don't go to Georgetown. If you want to understand the subjective globalization, what's global consciousness? What is it? Are we all from the same humanity on the same planet, which is maybe the biggest message of the Jesuits with their global mobility. If you want to understand that, go to Georgetown. Because at Georgetown, we won't be giving you a technical training. We'll be giving you understanding that we're one humanity. And that probably will make you understand much better international affairs.
Thank you. Joel, Jack, thank you for this opportunity to be sort of an outsider here as somebody who's not particularly part of the School of Foreign Service. I'm the head of the Jesuit Refugee Service. The information is out of date. We just got our newest information. We served 730,000 people last year. And we're the only ministry of the Society of Jesus directly under the tutelage of Father General. So JRS is a big deal for us. And what we've been talking about, what the three of you have been talking about, is very consistent with what we, and our sort of ethos, or sort of what motivates us. I'd like to just share a few stories today of people who I think capture some of what all three of you have been talking about. JRS was founded in 1980 by Father Pedro Rupe, who was then the General Superior of the Society. We've always had a missionary thrust, a sense of going wherever the world might take us. Father Rupe was Basque. He had been assigned to Japan for many years and happened to be in Hiroshima when the atomic bomb dropped. He had a little medical training, so he was treating people suffering from this, not knowing at that time that most of them did not have a positive outcome because of this tragic event. Out of that experience of accompanying people, I think a great compassion and a great sense came of we need to be of service and we need to walk with people, to accompany, to be in solidarity with people profoundly. In the late 70s, when what we've called the Vietnamese boat crisis took place, when so many Vietnamese were leaving the country, either drowning or killed by pirates, he was deeply moved with compassion and said, we have to do something. And so out of that, JRS was formed. Jesuits and religious sisters and volunteers came to accompany the Vietnamese in refugee camps. Being Jesuits, we couldn't just accompany, so we started teaching them English, and the rest is history. Education is now the largest particular intervention that we do around the world. So that sense of mission, that sense of a global reality has very much been a part of us since the very beginning. I'd like to also share the story of a woman who works for us. Her name is Heba Al-Basha. She is our country director in Lebanon. And I had the chance to see her a couple of weeks ago when I was in Lebanon for a meeting. By coincidence, one of the school's advisory board meetings, Steve Cashin, happened to be in Lebanon that day. He said, any chance of seeing some of the work? So we went to this little school in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Beirut. We work with young Syrian refugees, many of whom have been out of school for years, trying to get them ready, particularly teaching French and English so that they can participate in the Lebanese school system. And then we also work with their parents, particularly their mothers, who are often not well educated, feeling very isolated, not having connections in that city, and helping them, in a sense, become more integrated into the world that they are now living in. And Heba herself, she is Druze. She works with a group of Shia and Sunni and Christian and Orthodox, being a team which is really embracing this Syrian refugee community who is really putting, frankly, a burden on that country, a very, very fragile country. And what's amazing about her, and I think Steve can tell you, her engagement with the people, her engagement with the staff, her engagement with the children. She has taken that, it's not just learning about language, but it's really engaging people's hearts. That's what we can do, which really makes a difference. I want to add one more story about someone with a bit of a Georgetown background, Father Rick Riskavich, who died last month. Rick was an incredible person for many ways. He was the founding director of JRS USA. He taught for 3 years in Oxford as the Rupe Scholar, part of the Refugee and Migration Center there. We have a posting there which we've just recently renewed. And I think those of you who knew Rick knew that he was not a bleeding heart liberal, but he really took this demand that we engage refugees and migrants because of our deep values and because of who we are and what we are called to be in this world. One of the most amazing things I think that Rick did during his time at Fairfield before he came back to Georgetown, he coordinated a significant study on the reality of DACA students, and especially the presence of undocumented students in Jesuit education. It was one of those mind openers, I think, for everyone, saying what is the impact on these students and what are we missing by not welcoming them the way that we should be welcoming. So I would say that sense of mission, that sense of engagement, and that sense of scholarship, which is very much what you do in your school, is foundation to what we do. And I just want to end with a coda, a little passing story. In my previous life, I was the provincial of the California province. And during that time, a young scholastic came to me. He had been a very successful high school teacher. Could have gone on to theology. He could have stayed one more year to teach. But he came to me and he said, this Hurricane Mitch thing in Central America has been devastating. I want to go be with people. I want to learn what's going on. I want to see if I can make a difference there. So the young scholastic went to Honduras. It was a challenging year, but a very, very growthful year for him. And out of that, he continued on his path. You probably figured out that scholastic was Matt Carnes. I've been privileged to know him for many years. Our spirituality, the sort of Jesuit ethos says, go. Go out, be part of the world, engage the world, and trust that God will take us where we need to go. What we're doing and what you are doing draw from the same source.
Thank you very much, all of you. I want to follow up with a couple of questions before I open it up to the audience, and ask you to follow up with some of the themes in light of the challenges that we're facing today. And the theme of engagement, of walking with others, of going out to the boundaries and the borders. I want to overlay that with the problem of polarization. Because what we are seeing now, certainly, is a great desire of our students and others to reach out, to deal with migrant communities, to deal with the most vulnerable communities. Perhaps what we're seeing less of is a willingness to reach out and walk with those who you most violently disagree with, whose political perspective or social and cultural perspective is perhaps radically different. You see in Latin America, an extraordinary polarization that's ripping apart sort of societies across some Latin American countries that are destroying what were tremendous success stories. You see across Europe now a tremendous polarization that's pulling apart so many countries. We see in the United States a polarization. I'm wondering how the Jesuit value of reaching out, engaging, walking with others, trying to understand their perspectives, how that plays into polarization in this environment that we're facing now, and how do we engage with that when we still work in the context of an elite school in which we're really drawing from perhaps not every side of that polarized debate? It's a tough question, I know.
No, it's actually a very good question. There was a French MEP in Brussels who, the other day, called me, and she was saying that we haven't managed, we being I would say, to engage with those who are voting for the populist. Said we keep on talking to ourselves. The debates are among ourselves, the meetings are among ourselves, and we just haven't been able to reach out to them. And she was asking if there was a way we could do events, and be speaking to the ones who maybe have been also, in a way, or have been left on the sides. When you sometimes look at this Edelman Trust every year, which comes up with their trust, and you see that a lot of people are in fear. That's why they're in fear. They're in fear of, is technology going to leave them on the sides? Talk about Europeans, and it may be true for the US. Where is my future? Am I going to have a job? Why are we having all these other people come in while I don't have a job? Why are we talking about so many identities of minorities when which we're here, no one's talking about our identity. And when we speak about our identity, we're called to be intolerant. It's a very difficult discussion to have, because then the people representing these populist movements are not really people you can have a discussion with, the Nigel Farages and others. It's very difficult to have a very reasoned discussion. But I think it's really a challenge. I think it's a challenge for the media, where you must also maybe trying in newsrooms, which is a real challenge, I think, for mainstream media, is how do we get journalists who think differently in the newsrooms? it's quite difficult. So it's through the opinion pages where you have to get different views. But the engagement has been difficult. And I think it is actually, for me, it's one of the biggest reasons there has been a lot of, and that population has been engaged by others now.
I mean, from the angle of the Jesuits and thinking about how through discernment to get that engagement, I mean, any thoughts about how we should be thinking about this challenge going forward in the newsroom and in the classroom? And
I would love advice.
You know, one striking experience for me in the classroom was right after the 2016 presidential election in the United States. And so the very first class after that, I knew I had to throw out all my notes. It just didn't make any sense to try to have a normal lecture that day. And students came in with a wide range of opinions, but many of our students, because they come from one particular side of the political spectrum, were really pretty despondent and really came in with very heavy hearts. And I could tell they just weren't ready to talk normally. And so I said, I'm going to do something different today, something we've never done I've never done it before or after in a political science class. And I asked them actually, and this comes out of Jesuit spiritual practice, I had them actually journal in silence for a while. I said, just write down your feelings right now. Just get some of those things down. And then I said, I think after, and at this point we'd been together for almost 3 months, I said, I think we have a level of trust that's sufficient in this room, and we've sat us alongside each other long enough and talked about lots of different issues, that we can actually verbalize these things. Not in a crosstalk way, not in a way of challenging one another, but today let's just actually get these ideas out there. And it was remarkable to hear students speak and to listen to one another, And I just want to highlight 2 different comments that were really illuminating for me. One was a student who said, in this class, we've read this classic text by Benedict Anderson about imagined communities. And we talk about the ways that nations often are animated by some sense that we all belong to this same community somehow, even though we never met everybody in that community. And the student said, you know, we read that piece, and I always thought there was a single imagined community in the United States. And I discovered last night that there are 2, and there's one that I don't know, and I need to learn about it. And I thought, wow, what a really important realization for them to realize that there are other communities that they don't know. That's hugely important. And then one student later in the conversation said, I need to tell you how often I feel uncomfortable here at Georgetown, because one of the ways you display your political views at Georgetown's campus are the things you put on your computer, stickers on computers. And sometimes that's very, nice. We have SFS, and they put those up, and that's great. But there are other ones that clearly reveal one political side or another. And this student said, I feel like I am often silenced when I walk into a room because I just see all these different computer stickers on them, and they immediately tell me that I can't think this way. And he said, well, I have to tell you, my family comes from a town that lost lots of jobs, and my dad lost his job, and here's why he felt like the best thing that he could achieve would be with a Trump presidency, and here's why. And it was fascinating to hear students listen to that and actually just sit with that. What did I take away from it? 2 things. One is the importance of listening and of trying to understand the view of the other, even when we think we have well-founded reasons to have our own stance. And the other, and I tell students this when they graduate, the most important decision they will make in the next few years is not the job they'll take or the studies they'll pursue, but where physically at the micro level they will live. Okay, you can live in different parts of Washington, D.C., some of which you will never encounter someone that thinks any differently from you. There are other parts of Washington, D.C. that are incredible mixing places. And if you choose to live in places where you'll regularly encounter other people, then your ideas can start to understand their ideas, and you can start to see how we build conversations. But it's so easy to live in echo chambers and to live in these isolated communities. And so I keep saying over and over again, put yourself in solidarity. And the way you do that is physically where you choose to locate your body on a daily basis. If your body's not there, it's very hard to do it virtually.
And how, given the migration question you're dealing with every day.
I want to build on what you mentioned in terms of this whole issue of fear. And Matt, you had talked about, obviously, our economic system has benefited a whole bunch of people. And one of the things that I've heard and have stolen is that, globalization benefits all of us to some degree. But those who it hurts deeply, and those are felt in very very, very acutely in those places, your student's father, for instance. And I think those situations create fear. And remembering back when we are afraid of something, there's not much else we can think of. And from an Ignatian spirituality point of view, I would say fear becomes an attachment. It becomes a way that our thinking or our affect gets stuck. We can't move anywhere else, and certainly the echo chambers, whatever, who would keep that fear going, because it's a great organizing technique. There's only one thing, and we are afraid of that. Certainly here in Italy, we have a very similar dynamic going on, aggravated by an economy which is not growing like it is in the US. Many young people without reasonable hope of a long-term job anytime soon. What does that do to people's thinking? The two, if I can say, remedies and what we try and do, I would say one is encountering the other. If you hear somebody's story, that's what changes. If you meet somebody and realize this migrant, this refugee, I have much more in common with her story than what is separate. That begins, I think, to sort of free that attachment up a little bit. The other interesting thing, and this was something that our JRS USA director, Joan Rosenhauer, who used to work with CRS, was involved in some focus groups on people who said that I have a negative or a negative response to migrants or refugees. One of the questions that came up was, okay, we understand your point of view. Now, how does that match with your values, with your Christian values, with your religious values of the Good Samaritan or Matthew 25? And the overwhelming response to that was, I never thought about that. So how do we get people to connect with what they say is important to them and help to express that in a way which is congruent with what we all believe? So there's an outer journey of meeting somebody, but I think the inner journey is also important.
Well, I'm going to open up the questions, but before I do, I just want to say that in response to some of this conversation, as we think about where a school like SFS needs to go in the next 100 years, we are deeply thinking about the boundaries that we have to cross to deal with these kinds of challenges. One example, and what we've just been discussing here, the role of fear and alienation, has led us to place a much greater emphasis, for example, on thinking about things like performance, arts, narrative, and how it affects international affairs. Chris Chalenza is here, the dean of the college. We're working together on the Laboratory for Global Politics and Performance. And one of the events that they just did last week, which was incredibly emotional, was exactly the kind of exchange you were talking about, where they teamed up with Patrick Henry College, which is an evangelical college in rural Virginia, deeply known as conservative and in red state country, and they got students to write their stories and had Georgetown students tell the Patrick Henry stories, and the vice versa. And they told each other's stories. And by telling each other's stories and rehearsing it and going over it and building a relationship, it led to discoveries that they never would have expected. And that's the kind of thing I think that overcomes alienation. We think about it on fear and culture. There are other areas which are boundary crossing. We were talking a little bit about this earlier today with Cardinal Turkson. If you're thinking about the development challenges going forward, if you think about security challenges, it's about the interrelationship between science, technology, and international affairs, which was not part of the SFS curriculum in 1919, I can guarantee you. But if you think about cybersecurity, if you think about artificial intelligence, if you think about advanced computing, if you think about bioengineering, we need to make Georgetown the place in which the deep science and understanding of those advancements meets the ethical and moral foundation and the political understanding of the implications, so that we are a bridge between these exciting new technologies, but they're harnessing them for social good, for bringing people together and not dividing them. Similarly, even on the work that we're doing together with the business school, crossing boundaries between the private sector and the public sector. Because all of these problems have a public sector dimension and a private sector dimension. The private sector is as critical to solving them as the public sector is. So as we think about the next 100 years of SFS, we keep thinking about what are the boundaries we have to cross. How do we reach out across Georgetown to do that in collaboration so that we're actually putting together different ways of thinking and therefore walking with different constituencies in ways that will hopefully address some of the challenges we're facing. But I wanted to put that out there as that's some idea of where we're going. Happy to talk more about what that means in practice for SFS, what that means in practice for some of the things that we're doing. But let me open it up to you to ask questions of any of the panelists about some of the themes we're talking about today or anything about SFS and where we're going in the centennial year. Yes.
Thank you. First, I'm Ed Villani, a proud member of the class of '68 at Georgetown, former board member, chair of the board. And so as I sat here listening to it, there was one question and one observation, maybe more questions than that. The question is, you know, some 20 years ago, Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History. And I think a lot of people paid attention and probably bought into it. You know, and here we are, we talk about imagination. How were we so unimaginative that we missed some 20 years later what was happening? And what do we learn from that? You know, what are the lessons learned for the future? And then the observation is, as I think about listening, I think it is a problem. And I was wondering if we, and I'm not up to date on courses at Georgetown, but if we have enough opportunity to teach students about conflict resolution, where you walk in the shoes of others. And you don't do it for a day or a week, you do it for a semester, so that you really understand. And we have such a diverse student body that you have the opportunity to do that. But it takes some time. And instead of going off to safe spaces, you're forced to deal with, you know, whether it's Palestinian versus Israeli. I mean, there's so many of these different issues, and if you're forced to walk in the shoes of others, it gets you to think differently. I mean, you're talking about that, but I don't know whether we do it for a semester and whether there's the opportunity to do that.
I'm happy to talk a little bit on the conflict resolution side of what's happening at Georgetown. Georgetown actually does have a graduate program in conflict resolution that's sort of specially designed for that, but your point is broader, which is how do you integrate that not only into a specialized major or specialized degree, but how do you get that and build that into the experience of all students? And we're thinking a lot about that. One of the ways that we're doing it is trying to design classes differently. One of the most interesting things that we've adopted over the last couple of years and that we want to expand with the Centennial, and in fact, in honor of the Centennial, we call them Centennial Labs. We take courses that are built around problems, not around disciplines, so that you're asking yourself, what's the problem we're trying to solve? It could be drought, could be migration, could be hate speech. And you sort of look at all of the factors that come into play to solve that problem, because most of the factors will be multidisciplinary. But then we get at your point. In addition to doing the readings and discussions in class, we actually send the students out into the field to engage on those issues with problem solvers themselves. If not necessarily putting themselves in the role of others, and I think that is a challenge, and how do we foster that? It is getting them to experience what they've been reading and what they've been engaging on. Christian Wagner is here, and he's been leading students in some of these global experiences. What's brilliant about them is that they're deeply linked to the learning that they're doing in the class. Just the last spring, we sent them out during spring break. We send them out now during summer break. We send students out to India to look at drought, to look at public sanitation and the conflicts around them. We send students out to Jordan to look at how the communities are bringing in, dealing with the problem of forced migration at the local level. We send students to UNHCR to talk about how they're dealing with child migration issues. We send students out to Silicon Valley to talk about how the internet companies are dealing with hate speech and monitoring hate speech and thinking of a new regulatory framework on hate speech. We send students out to Kenya to talk about how the private sector is being engaged on development. So in each course, rather than thinking about a college education as you do your classrooms and then maybe you go to study abroad, and when you go to study abroad, you kind of live somewhere, but you don't really do something that is kind of linked to a particular challenge. We're trying to bring those things together, and so that every student has the experience of putting themselves in the position of a problem solver and talking to problem solvers from different perspectives and trying to get that engagement. And I think I'm hearing from students that it's transformative, that they go there and it's beyond the junior year abroad experience. It's one where it just opens up their eyes to how complex problems are, how little they know, how poorly applicable some of the things they're reading are, which gets to your point about what we didn't see coming. And I think it's fascinating. I'm excited about what we can do on it.
If I could just add one slight comment on that that builds on what you said, and that's Georgetown, because of the SFS's deep ties around the globe, has the opportunity to learn from other regions that have actually dealt with some of these conflicts, maybe ahead of the United States, or in a way that we, with some sort of, some sort of intellectual superiority, thought that we were somehow ahead, and actually we're learning that other regions have a lot to teach us. And just to highlight two examples of that. So in my Center for Latin American Studies, we've had long-standing connections with the country of Colombia and its long peace process. The Jesuits run one of the most important social analysis centers that's been involved in the dialogues at the grassroots level for like 3 or 4 decades now. So our students benefit from learning about that experience that then comes to the United States and helps us think about how do we build these, build past our conflicts, how do we work through our conflicts, how do we have these conversations by fits and starts in all the ways that we see that around the globe. And then the other example I want to highlight, Ambassador Milan Verveer is here, who heads our Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And they have brought so many peacemakers, especially women peacemakers, who have played such crucial roles in this around the globe. And to hear their examples of how they live this out, Colombia in particular, they've highlighted folks, but people from around the globe. And this is something where our students learn from practitioners on the ground who have lived this out. And that's a transformative experience for them.
Hi, thank you so much. That was extraordinarily interesting. I'm Charlotte Hohenstein, and I'm a history PhD, actually interested in the Jesuits, but also a sort of aspiring performer. And I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on the possible role of the arts. I know you brought it up at the end, Dean Hellman, and I was very excited to hear such an inspiring example. But it seemed to me, listening to everyone talk, that might be actually something of a missing piece here when we're thinking about cultural empathy being such a core value for the Jesuits and for the School of Foreign Service. And of course, the Jesuits have themselves such an extraordinary historical tradition of actually using the arts, both in their preaching efforts and their evangelization efforts, in sort of any way possible. I mean, they're sort of enmeshed with certainly Catholic Baroque, but I'm sure you could go much further beyond that. And it seems to me that certainly historically they appreciated it as a deeply powerful and innovative way to reach people in different ways. So I would love to hear more about your thoughts and perhaps personal experiences of this.
Anyone want to start on the arts?
I can mention one that just really was striking to me sort of in the last 20 years, and you can probably talk about what we're doing now on campus. So when I arrived in Honduras after Tom sent me there, probably the best experience of my life, the most challenging experience of my life, I discovered in El Progreso, Honduras, a theater company called Teatro del Fragua, so the Forge, set up by an American Jesuit who had gone there a couple decades before. And he had worked with local performers, training them, helping them devise an incredibly professional troupe that was able to perform in very modern ways traditional stories. He helped them uncover indigenous stories and tell their own indigenous stories. He helped them tell the story of the Gospels. I'll never forget, those of you that know the genealogy narrative in Matthew, it's about the boringest thing you can possibly read in the Gospels. But he set this to a rap. song. And they had 12 performers dancing around, bouncing around each other, doing this as a rap that then gave this idea of the Gospels and what the Gospels meant to a contemporary audience in Honduras. And then they had pieces that questioned the politics and the economics of the moment in very powerful yet slightly indirect ways that gave people a chance to voice things that they couldn't voice in any other way. So I think there are remarkable opportunities, and I think about the ways we can do that now, especially both with traditional performance, but also as our students become the authors and become the narrators of their own story, the power that can have in this moment as well.
Yeah, I have two quick comments on it. First, one builds on Ed Villani's earlier question about why we didn't see these things coming. I want to refer to a remarkable woman who you probably will be hearing more about. She's just about to take over our Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. Her name is Tamara Son, and she'll be the next director of the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. And she's building a minor for the school in religion, arts, and international affairs, because she says it's all, religion is the greatest expression of the arts, and arts are religion. But what she often sort of says is, who didn't see the Arab Spring coming? Any academic who studied the Middle East did not see it coming. Who did see it coming? All the comedians who were talking about the Middle East. She goes, if you were listening and you were hearing the kind of cultural ferment that was going on, through comedy, she goes, you would have seen, the risks that these regimes were facing. Comedy's not going to tell you the backlash against those risks, as we've sort of seen. But so there is culture, and what's happening in the culture is an enormously rich vein to help us understand political events. And as a professional political scientist myself, I think one of the reasons why we missed so much of what's generating populism, national self-identity, and a turn inward is because we just didn't understand. We looked at everything through an economic and through a political balance of power lens, and not through what it meant for people and their understanding of their own culture. Sherazad was referring to that earlier. So I think these are critical clues in understanding how politics is being shaped. But I would go further and say, I worry, and we started to talk about this, what are the solutions to a politics based on fear, to alienation as a strategy and a political strategy? You're not going to convince people that their economic situation is going to be better or worse. That's not what they're interested in. You need to, in some way, go back to where we started. You need to build empathy. And how do you build empathy? You build empathy, through inhabiting and understanding, people's perspectives. And I think that the arts, plays an absolutely critical role in establishing empathy. And I think it's interesting when I go back to 1919 and look at the history of the school. In the first year of the school, Father Walsh, who was really, and Scheherazade is right, really ahead of his time on many issues, and we'll hear a lot about Father Walsh and his views. But one of the things that Father Walsh said was, a problem in the United States is it doesn't understand cultures, and the way it needs to understand culture is through performance. So what he did was he asked every embassy in Washington, D.C. to host a cultural night at Georgetown. Now, the embassies weren't probably the best places to reflect culture, but it did show his view that we need to introduce these cultures to the world, and SFS could be a portal to do that. And America was an isolationist country, and the war jarred it out of that isolationism. And he thought that one way of doing it is to bring culture to the school. We lost some of that idea, but I think it's critical for us to reestablish it. Yes.
Yes, my name is Courtney Walsh, and I'm a reporter, and I cover Vatican issues here. And I was very interested in your comments about the media and the need to change the fear element. I work for Fox News, and I find what is so interesting is how fear sells. It's what gets the clicks. It's what brings in the money. And when you try to propose a a good feel story on different issues, they just don't sell. So how does one face that? What can we do to sort of train the next generation to have a kind of a different kind of response, if possible, in that regard?
Big question. I'm smiling because years ago I was on the board of an NGO we had launched in France called Reporters d'Espoir. So it was Reporters of Hope. And the whole idea behind this it was a nonprofit association, is we were trying to get positive stories out in a lot of different medias. So the stories of actually villages who have migrants and everything's going well. So the stories we don't see, and there's so many of them, and you're absolutely right, there is no interest. We closed down our association after 10 years just last year. So it was a private initiative of a variety of different people in media, but that was the whole idea, because the number of stories you can write about migration integration today in Europe, which is positive, I've got tons around me, we know. Yes, they're not covered, and they don't sell, and there is the fear, and the media does somewhere nourish the whole system. Having said that, what is today the real power of traditional media compared to social media, where people are creating their own false or true stories in an extraordinary, exponential way, sharing it without no control. So, but it is a question, and no one cares about the train that's been on time. You know, that's what we say in the media, everyone cares about the train that's late or the plane that's late. No one's going to cover the story that is good. But it is hopefully, and I think this goes to actually one of the universal objectives of the Jesuits. I think on this, and one of the really important points is this hope. How do we make the next generation hopeful? That they have hope and not in fear. Because with this over media, this over access of only fearful news, we're creating an extremely, I feel, a lot of mental health issues that even the migrants are having. All of them have their phones, and they're on the phone, and they're calling home, and they're telling lies, and because they're saying everything's good, and our kids are. So we're living in a very spontaneous, instant moments with very little time to see the hope. So all of this is linked, but I don't have a solution because the one we had didn't work out, so I'm very humbly telling you I'm very sorry, because there was this initiative and the other media would not take the stories that we were producing, which were wonderful stories, but no one clicked on them too much.
So quickly, I would just add that I think we are hardwired for fear. This is a genetic predisposition to make sure we stay alive, so that's always going to be there. Your story about the Patrick Henry students and the Georgetown students, I think that the only way is to go deeper. We can't solve this at a kind of, I'm going to scream louder than you. So how do we get people to go deeper? I mean, faith, values, whatever, but interesting, going back to this whole question of arts, I think the arts can also do that. That's one way, as you talked about, Teatro La Fragua. Some of the videos that all of us have seen, some of the photos. How do we use, in a sense, how do we use the media, acknowledging its power to influence in a world where some of those more traditional influences are frayed? How do we engage our students? How do we engage the people we serve? How do we engage refugees to put it out there, as you said, in social media, on people's phones, and say there is a different narrative here? And I think it is creating different narratives, but we've got to go deeper. A sort of battle is never going to resolve anything.
Just add one maybe simple idea to that. We model so much, not just in what we say and not just in the ideas, but actually the way we carry ourselves through difficult moments. And if we give ourselves over to the moment that it seems crisis, everyone else reacts with fear. If there's a way where we have a certain stability, and at least when I was very aware of this that day when I was teaching in the classroom, where students were so upset by this, and just my having been around a longer time to be someone who could say, this is adult life. This is, we have political changes happen, and and this is part of the ways we work out democratic life. And that modeling of a kind of stability, a belief in something more, then I think does really allow for a kind of hope. But if we give ourselves over to it, if we get caught up in the next thing, we just feed it and fuel it all the more.
Any further questions? I'm sorry? One thing I do want to say before I close is, I know we're going to move on to the next session of Jesuit Universities in Education for Global Citizenship, but one of the exciting things about having a Centennial event here on this topic is one, of course, is to take inspiration from our Jesuit background and our Jesuit identity, and that has fueled the school for a century. And I think that is very much about ideas and values and individuals and great teachers and professors and mentors that many people here and around the room remember. There is one aspect of the Jesuits that I have always been deeply intrigued about, understanding JRS, understanding the educational network that we're going to talk about later, which is the Jesuits have a global network, an unparalleled global network that enables or could enable students to walk with others, that could enable students to reach out to the boundaries and the borders. As many students, 64% of our students go off to junior abroad. The largest location is Copenhagen. Interesting place, lovely city, don't get me wrong. I love Copenhagen.
Program. Stop the exchange program.
But one wonders how more we can leverage our Jesuit engagement so that we're creating more and more opportunities for students to get out to deeper and deeper experiences that and I think you hit the nail right on the head, Tom, which is it's the depth of the experience that's critical. And I am thrilled to say, and I don't want to make light of our junior abroaders, I mean, we are sending students out to Rwanda, to Uganda, to Cote d'Ivoire, to Senegal, to Cambodia, to Jordan, to Lebanon. Our students are going out all over the world, but we could do more. And I think one of the aspects of the dialogue that I would love to hear during the course of our time together and beyond is given the issues that we've raised, given the challenges that we're setting up for the next 100 years, and given the fact that we are a Jesuit university that is linked to this wonderful global worldwide network of Jesuits, how we can better leverage that and deepen the experience of our students and our faculty to try to challenge these issues. Well, with that, thank you very much for being part of the discussion today. Thank you to our panelists. It's wonderful to have you all, and we look forward to the next discussion.